Disclaimer. This podcast contains sensitive material, which includes murder, offences against children, and violence. It will not be suitable for all listeners. For a list of confidential support, please see our show notes for more details, or visit our website. Listeners' discretion is advised. This is part 2 of episode 2. If you have not yet listened to part 1, we suggest you go back and listen to it before continuing. But in case you're not able to do that, here's a very brief account of what we discussed. In 1963, John Button was convicted of the manslaughter of Rosemary Anderson and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. Not long after Button's conviction, a notorious serial killer named Eric Edgar Cooke made a gallows confession that he had killed Rosemary Anderson. Despite Button's appeal using Cooke's confession as new evidence, his appeal was dismissed. Now let's return to the story. In 1959, 4 years prior to the murder of Rosemary Anderson, a heinous murder described as brutal and orchestrated in a callous fashion was discovered. Saturday the 19th of December 1959 was nothing out of the ordinary for Jillian Brewer. She lived on the ground floor in a block of apartments called the Brookwood Flats, close to the Stirling Highway, in the upmarket suburb of Cottesloe in Perth, Western Australia. The Brookwood Flats consisted of 3 apartments in a row on ground level, with another 3 directly above. Jillian Brewer's mother, Betty Johnson, lived in the centre flat, next door to Jillian. Brewer lived with her grey poodle, which was known around the neighbourhood for its incessant barking. The barking didn't really bother Brewer. She adored her dog and spent each day with it. On the northeast wall of her apartment, Brewer had hopper-type windows that opened inwards. On the Saturday night, Brewer spent the evening with her fiancé, Andrew Dinny. They talked and arranged to spend the next day together playing golf. They had sex before Dinny left almost exactly at midnight, leaving Brewer in bed naked, with the bedsheet pulled over her while the poodle slept under the bed. A small light was burning about half a metre outside the bedroom door. The windows of the bedroom were open, but were covered with wire insect screens. The windows were covered by curtains which did not quite overlap, leaving a gap in the middle and at one end. As Denny slipped out, he left the bedroom door slightly ajar, but made sure to pull the front door closed behind him, locking it. An hour later, neighbours heard Brewer's dog bark 3 or 4 times and then stop mid-bark, but thought nothing of it. It really wasn't out of the ordinary. The next day, Denny returned to Brewer's apartment at 9 a.m. He thought it was odd that the front door was closed. He walked around and saw the poodle excitedly jumping up and down at the bedroom window. "Hello?" he called as he knocked on the glass window. There was no reply. All he could hear was barking. Confused, he let himself in with a key. Then he walked inside the apartment, taking a good look around. Her bedroom door was shut. She must have been up during the night, he thought. But when he opened the bedroom door, he looked at his girlfriend in shock. Brewer was lying on her bed with the sheet pulled up to her chin. She was lying on her back, her face covered in blood, and with one arm out over the sheet across her chest. She had been wounded, showing signs of extensive bruising on her neck, a deep slash to her throat, and with a large lacerated wound where something had penetrated deep into her pubic bone and fractured it. Maxwell Watson, who lived in a neighbouring street, had noticed that his hatchet had been taken from his garage, where he kept it hanging from a hook on the left-hand side. A hatchet is a small axe with a handle which can be used with one hand. There was no firm evidence of how Brewer's attacker had obtained entry to the apartment. There were no signs of forced entry, although there was a fresh cut to the insect screen which also had a hole in it, covering the window near the front door. It was possible that the person who attacked Brewer could have reached through from either of the holes and opened the latch securing the insect screen. No stranger's fingerprints were found in the flat. On the 7th of April 1961, Darryl Beamish was arrested and charged with the aggravated assault of 4 young girls, each of whom was 4 or 5 years old. The assaults had taken place over a period of 5 months. In each case, Beamish had taken the child to Kings Park in Perth, removed part of her clothing, and then interfered with her sexually, although there was no evidence of actual sexual intercourse in any of the cases. Beamish pleaded guilty to all charges, and he was remanded in custody for sentence. Shortly after the remand, he was taken by 2 detectives, Detective Sergeant Leach and Detective Dealing, to the flat in which Brewer had lived. Because Beamish was deaf and mute, the 3 men were accompanied by Florence Myatt, who was a public relations officer and interpreter for the then Adult Deaf and Dumb Society. The interpreter had known Beamish for some time and had previously interpreted for him. He initially denied any knowledge of the murder of Jillian Brewer, but while in the police car outside a dentist's premises prior to Florence Myatt's dental appointment, he confessed. Detective Sergeant Leach, while in the car, had asked Myatt to communicate to Beamish. He said, "I want to find out the truth. You know we have lots of things to help us, like scientific aids and photographs. My boss wants me to find out the truth. Did you hurt the lady?" Myatt communicated this to Beamish. He replied, "Yes, finish. I want to tell the truth." Myatt didn't go to her dental appointment, instead deciding to go back to the police station so she could assist Leach with further questioning. As Beamish had a limited English vocabulary, Myatt had to alter the phraseology of ordinary English words to some extent. For example, when asked how she would convey the words, "I want to warn you that you are not obliged to say anything unless you wish to do so, and if you do, it may be used in evidence against you," She said that she communicated these words: "I want to warn you that you may or may not want to tell the truth or not. If you do, it may be against you, or perhaps bad for you." Shortly after Beamish's initial confession, he said, "Not me killed Lady Cottesloe." At the trial, Beamish cried. He said again and again that he had nothing to do with the murder of Brewer. Beamish said that when he was questioned on the 7th of April, he was threatened, and Myatt suggested answers to him. However, Myatt denied ever having done so. When giving evidence, Detective Sergeant Leach said that in the car he said to Beamish, "What did you hurt the lady with?" And he said, "An axe." Leach said this axe was the hatchet that had been taken from Watson's house in a neighbouring street. Leach said that he had asked Beamish, "Did the lady die?" Beamish replied, "Yes, after I hit her with the axe." Leach asked, "What was the lady doing when you hit her with the axe?" He said, "Asleep on bed." Leach said he again interviewed Beamish on the 12th of June, when he was accompanied by Detective Sergeant Balcom and Reverend Christopher Chetwynd of the Missions to Seamen, who was acting as an interpreter, and with Myatt again present. The prosecution argued that Beamish was sexually perverted and suggested that the killer must surely have been sexually perverted. Beamish was cross-examined by the prosecutor without objection from his own counsel about other offences he had committed, including theft and assaulting the young girls in Kings Park. In a normal run-of-the-mill case, counsel would object on the basis that the questions were irrelevant to the current trial. The prosecution's justification for this highly prejudicial cross-examination was that Beamish had told the court that the police officer had not been truthful. The aim was to justify the attack on Beamish's character. In prison, Beamish joined a prison carpentry crew where he worked alongside John Button, who had been imprisoned for the manslaughter of Rosemary Anderson. Beamish had been in prison for 2 years by the time Button arrived. One day, another prisoner turned to Button, pointed at Beamish and said, "He's innocent like you, John." Button was intrigued by the comment and began to spend his days learning sign language so he could talk to Beamish and figure out if he really was innocent. And if he was, why on earth he had confessed. Eventually, when Button was able to communicate with him, Beamish signed, "Police wanted someone to pin it on, and they beat me." 2 years into Beamish's sentence, and 6 months into Button's, news came over the radio that Eric Edgar Cooke was in police custody after confessing to 7 murders, including the hit-and-run murder of Rosemary Anderson and the axe murder of Jillian Brewer, the 2 women Button and Beamish were convicted of killing. Button's heart almost stopped. A sensation came over him that finally there was a resolution to this awful miscarriage of justice. That night Button couldn't sleep. He found Beamish and discovered that he too had learned about Cooke and his confession. But no one in officialdom had spoken to either of them about it. 1 week later, Button's lawyer launched an appeal using Cooke's confession as new evidence. But, much to Button's disappointment, the judges refused to believe the confession. In their view, Cooke falsely confessed in an attempt to delay his execution, which was due to be carried out after his conviction for a separate murder. On the 26th of October 1964, between 7:45 and 7:50 a.m, in the presence of the Reverend Ralph Thomas, Cooke took the Bible in his hand and said, "I swear before Almighty God that I killed Anderson and Brewer." Cooke was hung 10 minutes later at 8 a.m. The hope of any chance of clearing either Beamish or Button was minimal. On the 12th of November 1964, Reverend Jenkins made a statement which read as follows: "I am an honorary prison chaplain attached to Fremantle Jail. I was acquainted with Eric Edgar Cooke when he was a young man. Upon Cooke becoming an inmate of Fremantle Prison, following upon his trial for the murder of one Sturkey, I visited him regularly at our jail. Following his conviction for the murder of the said Sturkey, on almost every occasion I visited him, he made reference to the subject of the Brewer and Anderson killings, and the fact that Beamish and Button were serving sentences in respect thereof. Cooke repeatedly stated that he was the person responsible for these killings, but I did not discuss any detail with him of the circumstances surrounding the killings. At the time the date was fixed for the execution of Eric Edgar Cooke, I was engaged in a church conference, and I was out of contact with Cooke until Friday the 23rd of October 1964. I visited him at 9:30 a.m. on that day. Cooke discussed with me the fact that the date for his execution had been fixed, and acknowledged the justice of the decision to hang him. On this day, he said he was concerned about the fact that Beamish and Button were still being held for crimes which he had committed. Without any prompting from me, he took the Bible from me and said, "I swear before God I did these two." The reference to these two was to Mrs. Brewer and Anderson. I was alone with Cooke on this occasion. I called to see him again on Sunday the 25th of October 1964, and finally I attended with the Reverend Ralph Thomas on the morning of the 26th of October 1964. Although Button was released on parole 5.5 years into his sentence, he was still a convicted man who bore the stigma that came with that. Button never wavered from the opportunity to clear his name. He wrote to journalists, but no one took his story as he had been convicted. One day a journalist named Estelle Blackburn called and said, "I'm going to help you, John." Greatly relieved, Button told her everything he knew. Journalist Brett Christian agreed to publish Blackburn's biography of Eric Cooke. For 6 years, Blackburn worked on her book titled Broken Lives, about Eric Cooke, Beamish and Button. Blackburn's efforts to clear Button's name led to renewed interest in the case. Broken Lives received wide publicity and detailed new evidence from two witnesses who cast doubt on Button's conviction. The new evidence led the Western Australian Attorney General to agreeing to reopen Button's case and send it back to the appeal courts. Following the initial publication of Broken Lives, Blackburn received a number of awards, the most significant being the prestigious Walkley Award for the greatest contribution to journalism, and induction into the West Australian Women's Hall of Fame. The renewed public interest in the case led to several appearances in the electronic media, including on ABC's Australian Story. As part of the Australian Story series, a two-part program about Button was broadcast. In the second episode, a panel of all those concerned in the case engaged in a session of restorative justice. As a practice, restorative justice brings together people who have been affected by a crime in a safe and structured way to discuss what happened and how they were impacted. In a particularly moving segment, Anderson's elderly parents gradually realised that the man they had blamed for 40 years for killing their daughter was, in truth, innocent. The public became outraged at the injustice that had been perpetrated. Their expectation was that with the new evidence that had been uncovered, Button would be exonerated. However, the actual evidence given in court by the two new witnesses was not what was expected and did not hold up. The increased media profile afforded an opportunity to engage in public speaking, and Blackburn assisted with the preparation of the appeal cases for both Button and Beamish by acting as a media liaison person for each of their defence teams. As the original court files had included good photographs of Button's car, which was alleged to have been the murder weapon, one of the world's leading experts on pedestrian crashes, William Haight, was engaged to review the available evidence. After conducting extensive reviews, Haight said that no firm conclusion could be reached about which car killed the girl. His reason for that conclusion was that neither of the cars said to have been involved in the murder had been crash tested. Initially, at Beamish's first appeal in 1964, the judges in the Court of Criminal Appeal labelled Cooke's confession as a lie, referring back to Button's case. The Chief Justice wrote, "Cooke claims to have had little damage to the car he was driving. What damage there was resembles, in some measure, that which was found on Button's car. The mathematical odds against such a coincidence beggar the imagination." However, journalist Brett Christian, who had published Blackburn's Broken Lives, arranged for the crash expert Haight to travel to Western Australia after purchasing 3 1962 Simca sedans, the type of car which had been owned by Button when Rosemary Anderson was murdered, and a 1962 Holden sedan, the type of car Eric Edgar Cooke had owned at the same time. Haight brought with him a biomedical human form dummy for accurate simulation in a pedestrian crash. The aim of the test was to show the displacement of the body after it had been hit. The simulation was set up with video equipment which, for the purpose of giving evidence in court, recorded from various angles, including from cameras inside the cars. The three Simcas were crash tested at speeds of 43, 50 and 59 kilometres per hour. The damage to the cars varied, but the position of the damage to the cars was consistent. Haight was able to explain the reason for this, depending on the length of the bonnet and the design of the car. At highway speeds, the head strike often occurs on windscreens. The body then continued to cartwheel, and because of the shape of the Simca, it was flung to one side before contacting the windscreen and then ending up on the side of the road within a metre of the vehicle. Of the three test Simcas, none of them sustained the damage shown in the police photos of Button's car, and in respect of which Button had provided an innocent explanation. And Button's car did not have the bonnet damage suffered by all of the test cars. When he concluded the testing, Haight declared immediately that Button's Simca could not have struck Ms. Anderson with sufficient force to kill her or to even seriously injure her. Furthermore, the tests failed to displace the body more than 1 metre, nowhere near close to the 2 to 3 metres described by witnesses. Haight then conducted one more test. Using the Holden, he hit the dummy at 56 kilometres per hour with the left side of the bonnet. The Holden sustained severe damage to the bonnet's leading edge, and some damage from the dummy's head to the rear of the bonnet. The dummy then cartwheeled towards the roof of the car and struck the visor above the left-hand side of the windscreen. The visor caused the dummy to deflect laterally, 2 metres to the left of the car, precisely the distance described by the witnesses. In 2000, Button's new appeal was heard. Haight was able to swear in court that Rosemary Anderson's murder could have occurred exactly as Cooke described it, and that it was not possible for Button's car to have killed her. The success of Button's appeal raised doubts about the Court of Appeal's reasons for rejecting Cooke's confession. Haight also contributed to Beamish's appeal. The appeal court handed down its decision in Button's case in February 2002, a complete exoneration. The 3 Court of Appeal judges said that Haight's evidence was compelling and convincing. It had been almost 40 years since Mr. Button's conviction. That was the longest time lapse between conviction and exoneration in Australia's legal history. The Western Australian government awarded him $460,000 in an ex gratia payment. Mr. Button was 58 years old when he walked into the Central Police Station in Perth and witnessed the destruction of his criminal record, a wrongful record that commenced when he was just 19 years old. Button started up the Innocent Project in Perth, and saw it established at Edith Cowan University. He helped people navigate the legal system and provided substantial support to those in need. He visited inmates in jail and took their phone calls for a period of time before relocating to New South Wales. In 2005, Beamish's conviction was overturned by the Court of Criminal Appeal. He had spent 15 years in prison for a murder he did not commit. In this case, the Western Australian government awarded him $425,000 in an ex gratia payment. The Attorney General said that the payment was intended to express the state's sincere regret for what had occurred and provide Beamish with a measure of comfort and financial security in his retirement. Imagine now that you have been convicted of a crime you did not commit, found guilty in a court of law. Your friends and family asking, begging you for the reasons why you committed the crime. Imagine serving every day, asking yourself, how did I get here? Was it by circumstance, poor mental health, wrong place, wrong time, wrong connections? When you are released, you are forced to restart your life. You have limited support from family and former friends because most of them believe you committed the crime. You have no home, no money, and no credit to make a call. It is difficult to obtain work, a bank account, any type of health insurance, or even proper identification documents. You are forced to adapt to a new life beyond prison walls. What you did in jail for the past 5, 10 or 15 years was robotic. You were told what to do and when to do it. You never had an opportunity to make your own decision about anything. And every day was the same. From cell to yard to mess room, work to yard, yard to mess room, recreation to cell. You are now thrust back into a world that has changed markedly since you were last in it. Technology is totally different. There are crowds of people everywhere, all in a hurry. Many of the shops you knew and people you knew have gone. You are in a totally different world, and you have to somehow cope with it. There is no one to tell you what to do or where to go. There is no one to help. When you are released, your real punishment starts. And although this is your time to clear your name, where do you begin? How do you do it in this new and unfamiliar world?